Hello and welcome to Weekly News Highlights. Let's begin with keywords that made headlines this week. South Korea's homegrown Nuri rocket successfully completed its fourth mission early Thursday, lifting 13 satellites into orbit in the country's first nighttime launch. The milestone highlights Korea's growing space capabilities and the increasing role of private industry. The Bank of Korea has held its key interest rate steady at 2.5% for a fourth consecutive meeting, pausing its easing cycle amid concerns over currency volatility and financial stability. And its updated growth forecast was slightly higher than the August projection. South Korean President Lee Jae-myung has wrapped up a historic four-nation tour across the Middle East and Africa, securing major agreements on AI, defense, and infrastructure while strengthening South Korea's diplomatic ties. President Lee has stressed the importance of Korea's defense industry on the global stage during his weekly meeting with his senior aides as he returned home from a long overseas trip. Yoon Jung-min reports.
President Lee Jae-myung opened the weekly meeting with his senior aides on Thursday by noting global interest in South Korea's defense industry the day after returning home from his 10-day-long trip to the Middle East and Africa that also took him to the G20 summit in South Africa.
국제 질서가 점점 불안정해지고 또 자국 이기주의가 심해지다 보니까 국가 간 대결 양상도 점차 심각해져 갑니다. 그래서 그런지 이 방위 산업과 무기 체계에 대한 관심들이 매우 높다고 판단이 되었습니다.
He added that he felt the horrors of the war-torn Gaza Strip during his trip to the MENA region. Given such a situation, it was no coincidence that the arms industry and weapons topped the agenda as the South Korean leader met his foreign counterparts during the trip. President Lee called for unity by the people to raise the nation's economic, defense, and diplomatic capabilities, apparently mindful of division and conflict at home.
지금 있는 역량을 최대한 모아서 국제사회 질서 속에서 경쟁을 하더라도 매우 부족한데 불필요하게 우리 자신의 역량을 낭비하는 일이 최소화되면 좋겠다는 생각이.
The South Korean president, who's just 6 months into his presidency, has had a busy diplomatic schedule throughout the year as he either attended or hosted major multilateral dialogue, engaging with the G7, UN, ASEAN, APEC, and G20 members at a time of deepening global uncertainties.
이 과정에서 정부는 대한민국의 글로벌 외교를 복원시키기 위해서 모든 노력과 역량을 투입했습니다. 그 결과 우리 외교의 위상이 한층 높아지고 외교 지평도 크게 넓어졌다는 게 체감되었습니다.
He instructed his aides to work together with relevant ministries to materialize deliverables that were yielded through his summit diplomacy during the past half year. Lee has been stressing pragmatic diplomacy centered on national interests since taking office, with a focus on bolstering cooperation with the global community on AI, cutting-edge technologies, defense industry, and K-culture. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
President Lee Jae-myung concluded a 10-day four-nation tour of the Middle East and Africa. Our top office correspondent Song Yoo-jin walks us through the highlights of his latest diplomatic agenda.
A four-nation trip spanning 10 days. President Lee Jae-myung's first stop on his longest overseas trip yet was a state visit to the United Arab Emirates, South Korea's only special strategic partner in the Middle East.
아랍에미리트 연합이 아마 가장 큰 구체적 성과가 있는 것 같습니다. 거기는 사전에 비서실장이 특사로 가서 협업할 수 있는 분야들도 많이 정리했고 또 구체적 사업도 다 발굴을 했기 때문에.
Following his summit with UAE President Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, the two countries issued a joint declaration to strengthen their partnership and signed 7 MOUs. What stands out the most is the promise of cooperation in AI and defense. South Korea will join the UAE's multi-billion-dollar Stargate project and co-establish hyperscale AI data centers. In defense, the two sides agreed to jointly develop, produce, and even export weapon systems, which the presidential office says could lead to more than $15 billion in orders for Korean firms. From the UAE, President Lee traveled to Egypt, a country with 30 years of diplomatic ties with Korea. Lee said expectations for the summit had initially been modest, but his talks with President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, which ran nearly twice the scheduled time, unveiled new opportunities.
카이로 공항을 확장할 계획인데 거기가 아마 4조 원 정도 들지 않겠냐 이렇게 얘기를 하고 그걸 한국 기업들이 좀 맡아서 확장하고 운영도 해주면 좋겠다.
The two leaders agreed to broaden cooperation in international peace, the economy, and defense. MOUs on education and cultural exchange were signed. During his lecture at Cairo University, President Yi unveiled his vision for the broader Middle East, the SHINE Initiative.
S는 스테빌리티, 안정을, H는 하모니, 조화를, I는 이노베이션, 혁신을, N은 네트워크를, E는 에듀케이션, 교육을 뜻합니다.
The trip's main event followed, the G20 summit in South Africa. Making his G20 debut, President Yi emphasized the need to make artificial intelligence globally accessible and the importance of restoring the multilateral trading system. Good news for South Korea was also made official.
G20 정상회의 출범 20년인 2028년 다시 의장직을 맡아 여정을 함께 이어가려 합니다.
On the sidelines, President Yi held his first bilateral talks with the leaders of France and Germany. Yi's final stop was Turkey, often called South Korea's brother nation bound by blood for its military contributions to the Korean War. Attention was on whether progress could be made on Korea's bid to join Turkey's Sinop nuclear power plant project. Presidents Yi and Recep Tayyip Erdogan agreed to deepen cooperation in defense, nuclear energy, and biohealth.
한국의 우수한 원전 기술과 안전 운영 역량이 튀르키예의 원전 개발에 실질적으로 기여할 수 있기를 바랍니다.
A joint statement was issued covering these areas, along with 3 MOUs on veterans affairs, nuclear energy, and road infrastructure.
President Yi says his four-nation tour this time was about strengthening existing partnerships, uncovering new areas of cooperation, and laying a firmer diplomatic foundation. It remains to be seen how the agreements made during this trip will further expand South Korea's diplomacy, especially across the global south. 송유진, Arirang News.
This week, South Korea saw the successful fourth launch for its homegrown Nuri rocket at Gohungun County, Jeollanam-do Province. The launch on Thursday carries much significance for various reasons. To discuss this further, we have our correspondent An Sung-jin with us in the studio today. Welcome, Sung-jin.
Thank you for having me, Sujin.
So can you start us off by walking us through some of the key takeaways for this fourth mission?
Right, the Nui rocket this time was launched at Thursday at 1:13 a.m. Now, the reason why I do want to highlight this is because it was the first time that the Nui rocket was launched in the middle of the night. Now, the time a rocket launches is not arbitrary and is determined by several critical factors, but if we look at previous launches, the first launch was at 5 p.m., the second launch was at 4 p.m., the third launch was at 6:24 p.m., and Thursday's fourth launch, which was initially set for 12:35 a.m., was pushed to 1:13 a.m. Now, you might ask why during the nighttime? The main objective is to conduct a scientific research on the space environment in high-latitude regions by observing faint auroras and airglow, which is why the fourth launch time was set for the very early morning. Now, another element that has to be pointed out is that unlike previous launches, which were led by the government, this fourth Nuri launch is the first to be prepared as a public-private joint mission, with the private sector taking the lead and the government providing support. The collaboration between the public and private sectors for this launch involves the Korea Aerospace Research Institute overseeing the manufacturing and assembly of the Nuri rocket, while ensuring the smooth transfer of technology. KARI's priority is ensuring the mission's scientific success and validating the rocket's enhanced performance with its primary goal of successfully placing all 13 satellites. Hanwha Aerospace took the lead in the entire production process, including manufacturing, the launch vehicle, final assembly, and managing the participating component suppliers.
And because this is a major milestone, so there was a lot of excitement around this, so how did the general public react to this?
Right, so before the launch, we obviously saw much excitement from the Korean people. Citizens had gathered by nearby Space Observatory to witness such a major national endeavor. Despite the cold, visitors had gathered early on, setting up their tripods to catch such a rare moment. Now, immediately after the launch, citizens cheered and applauded after witnessing such a major national achievement. Despite the late hour, the cold weather, and a delay of about 20 minutes, unwavering enthusiasm created a good atmosphere.
So, Seongjin, what does this suggest for the future of South Korea's aerospace industry?
Right, so the Lee Jae-myung administration had already pledged to invest in the aerospace industry of South Korea, more specifically the space-independent research. And this launch will be seen as South Korea formally entering the global commercial space market, positioning itself to compete with established private players like SpaceX. Now, that being said, South Korea may seem like it's still taking baby steps, as the latest launch happened nearly 3 years after the last one. The cumulative number of launches, it's still small. But the number of countries that have developed a launch and rocket with their own domestic technology is limited. And based on this capability, South Korea would take place as the 7th country in the world to develop its own space launch vehicle. With the success of the 4th mission, Seoul could solidify its position as one of the top 7 space powers in the world. And even further beyond that, the country is looking to develop a lunar lander scheduled for 2032.
So it looks like there's a lot to look forward to. So thank you so much for sharing your insight with us today, Seongjin.
It was a pleasure to be here, Sujin.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 엔진 점화.
The Bank of Korea has maintained its interest rate at 2.5% for the 4th policy session in a row amid concerns over currency volatility and financial stability. Our financial correspondent Moon Ji-young reports.
The Bank of Korea has once again held its key interest rate at 2.5%, continuing with its easing cycle pause for a 4th straight meeting amid rising concerns over currency volatility and financial stability risks. This decision follows the final Monetary Policy Committee meeting of the year on Thursday.
Although inflation has inched higher and uncertainty over the growth outlook persists, consumption and exports continue to improve, and financial stability risks remain. Given these conditions, we judge that maintaining the current policy rate while closely assessing domestic and external developments is appropriate.
The move comes as the Korean won has slipped into the upper 1,400 won range against the dollar, a 7-month low. Officials say a rate cut could add pressure to the currency amid uncertainty about U.S. monetary policy and strong dollar demand from overseas investment. Household debt and house prices, especially in the Seoul metropolitan area, also remain key concerns. On the same day, the central bank also released its updated economic outlook. It now expects the economy to grow 1% this year and 1.8% next year, slightly higher than its August forecast.
We expect exports and facilitated investment to grow more than initially forecast, largely due to the conclusion of the Korea-U.S. trade negotiations and a strong global semiconductor market. On the consumption side as well, expansionary fiscal policy and improving economic sentiment are expected to accelerate the pace of recovery.
Even so, the bank cautions that uncertainty remains, particularly regarding the global trade environment and the speed of the semiconductor recovery. Inflation is now projected at 2.1% for both this year and next year, reflecting the weaker won and a modest pickup in domestic demand. The bank expects inflation to stay above its 2% target for now, with the outlook hinging largely on exchange rate movements and global energy prices. The Korea-US key rate gap currently stands at 1.5%. With the U.S. Federal Reserve meeting next month, markets are watching closely for any shift in U.S. rate policy. The Bank of Korea is maintaining a cautious stance, and while rate cuts remain on the table, any further move will depend on growth, inflation, and financial stability in the coming months. Moon Ji-young, Arirang News.
South Korea may be showing signs of a turnaround in its long-standing decline in birth rates. In September, the number of newborns recorded the largest year-on-year increase in 18 years. Our Kim Bo-kyung reports.
The number of babies born between January and September surpassed 190,000 this year, marking the largest year-on-year increase in 18 years. That's according to a report released on Wednesday by the Ministry of Data and Statistics. A total of 22,369 babies were born in September, an increase of more than 8% or 1,780 compared to the same month last year. Births have been rising for 15 consecutive months since July last year, and September's figure is the highest for any September since 2020, when 23,499 babies were born. A total of 191,040 babies were born from January to September this year, up 12,488 from the same period last year, marking the largest year-on-year increase in 18 years since 2007. Based on the continued rise in births and marriages since the second half of last year, the number of total births this year is expected to exceed last year's total of 238,317. The uptick in births was driven largely by women in their 30s. The ministry said age-specific fertility rates increased across all age groups except those in their late 20s, with the rate rising by 2.4 among women in their early 30s and by more than 5 among those in their late 30s. The total fertility rate, the expected average number of children a woman will have in her lifetime, was 0.85 in September, up 0.06 from the same month last year. The increase in births can also be attributed to a rise in marriages. The number of marriages in September jumped more than 20% on year to 18,462 and has been rising for 18 consecutive months since April last year. Both the increase in numbers and the growth rate were the highest ever recorded for any September. But although marriages and births are increasing, one expert says there is still room for the improvement.
But even if the fertility rate goes up, it'll still be relatively low. It'll only be around 0.8. And if you want to maintain a stable population, the fertility rate has to be around 2.1. So even though the improvement in the fertility rate is good news, it's still less than half of what we really need.
Though more people in their early 30s are getting married and having children, experts say more needs to be done to keep this trend going. Kim Bo-kyung, Arirang News.
South Korea is debating whether to ease a decades-long principle separating banks and commerce to support massive AI and semiconductor investments. Our economics correspondent Kim Do-young covers the point of contention.
The separation of banks and commerce is nearly a century-old worldwide law effective for 43 years in South Korea. The rule is simple. Industrial companies cannot own banks. It was established to prevent powerful conglomerates from treating financial affiliates as private ATMs, stopping them from risking depositors' money for reckless expansion. But the sheer cost of the AI and semiconductor war is forcing a rethink. The debate reignited last month after President Lee Jae-myung met with OpenAI CEO Sam Altman alongside the leaders of Samsung Electronics and SK Group. Following the meeting, President Lee hinted at deregulation, suggesting that without massive capital injections, the nation's strategic industries could fall behind. However, the opposition is fierce and organized. Civic groups, including the Citizens Coalition for Economic Justice and Economic Reform Solidarity, argue that loosening these rules is a dangerous regression. They warn that deregulation could destabilize the financial system and deepen the concentration of economic power. Specifically, critics point out that this looks like a tailored favor for the SK Group. Unlike other conglomerates, SK faces unique investment limitations under its current holding company structure. Opponents argue that altering a fundamental economic law to solve the liquidity issues of a single conglomerate constitutes unfair bias. Government regulators are also pumping the brakes. Fair Trade Commission Chair Ju Byung-gi cautioned against shaking the backbone of the economic system. But the industry argues that government funds alone are a drop in the bucket. Korea Chamber of Commerce and Industry Chairman and SK Group Chair Che Tae-won says the current system cannot handle the costs of the future and that he wasn't trying to repeal banking and commerce laws. He emphasized the funds needed. A single gigawatt scale data center costs 70 trillion won to build. Meanwhile, the US and China are planning hundreds of them.
Our message is being distorted, as if we are just complaining about a lack of funds or demanding that the separation of banking and commerce be scrapped. That is not our intention. We are simply asking for a new system capable of handling this scale of investment.
The ruling Democratic Party has proposed a compromise allowing holding companies to establish special purpose vehicles for strategic investments. Policymakers now face a critical test: how to fuel the engines of AI growth without dismantling the financial safety rails that have protected the economy for decades. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
Tourism and culture exchanges are helping reshape South Korea-Japan relations. Japan's top tourism official highlighted the role of travel and personal exchanges in building broader diplomatic ties. Our foreign affairs correspondent Oh Seung sat down with him.
Everyday travel is creating a new sense of normalcy in South Korea-Japan relations, with tourism and culture expanding as the two friendly neighbors work towards future-oriented ties. That's according to Yuichi Shimizu, Executive Director of Japan National Tourism Organization in Seoul.
I think the key point is that each country now exists as a familiar, everyday presence in the other. Every visitor forges their own memories, encounters, discoveries, and moments of surprise the closer they look. For every trip, there is that much emotion.
This year marks the 60th anniversary of Korea and Japan's normalization of diplomatic ties. The decades since have seen fluctuations in bilateral relations. During a period of heightened diplomatic tension in 2019, Korean travel to Japan fell by almost 26% to 5.6 million. But that trajectory is changing. Shuttle diplomacy resumes between government leaders and active travel between citizens. In just the first half of 2025, 4.8 million Koreans visited Japan, nearly half of Seoul's population.
For Korean visitors, travel to Japan has become something very familiar. It doesn't require particular effort. It's significant that people now consider Busan or Fukuoka for their trip the following week.
The demographic makeup of visitors has also broadened.
It's slightly early to call it a trend, but solo travelers, visitors in their 20s and 30s are the core. But we also see families and those whose children finish schooling. It is encouraging to see such a wide range of age groups.
The volume of traffic from Japan to Korea has been comparatively smaller, which the executive director attributes to Japan's lower passport ownership rate. 1.2 million Japanese tourists came to Korea in the first quarter of this year, 98.5% of pre-pandemic levels. The increase was driven by individuals than group travellers, indicating sustained popularity of Korean pop culture. Shimizu suggested this also offers an opportunity for cultural collaboration to encourage two-way travel.
This is just my idea, but if Japan and Korea could create joint dramas or films, content that strengthens enthusiasm on both sides, I think that would be marvelous.
Japan has boosted practical support for visitors from Korea, including smoother entry procedures.
The recent priority entry lane for travelers between Japan and Korea was very well received. When it comes to expanding regional routes, travel agencies and local communities are putting in considerable effort. We help promote the appeal of these regions and drive demand.
Among them are smaller cities with unique regional charm, as Koreans increasingly seek immersive experiences.
There are many wonderful places Koreans have not yet visited. I'd like to introduce places without direct flight connections. Nagano Prefecture offers rich culture and nature. Matsumoto, in particular, has beautiful streets, bars, cafes, and the national treasure, Matsumoto Castle.
He emphasized the role of direct encounters in shaping perceptions going ahead. A survey this year found that over 1 in 2 Koreans believe bilateral ties grew stronger through culture and sports over the past 60 years, compared to 1 in 3 who cited improvements in diplomacy and security.
It is not Japan seen through the news, but what you see with your own eyes, experience for yourself, and where you interact with people, those personal memories that accumulate. I believe these are what truly improve our relations.
Making special moments ordinary, Shimizu says he hopes endless discoveries and personal encounters will continue to build familiarity and friendship between the two sides. 오수영, Arirang News.
And that brings us to the end of Weekly News Highlights. Thank you for watching and enjoy the rest of your weekend.